Thank you for the trailer, Horishadun. A very warm afternoon to all. On behalf of Surendranath College, I welcome you all to this International Faculty Enrichment Program organized by Department of Zoology, Chemistry, Botany, and Physics under the DBT-Star College scheme. I would now like to request our principal, Dr. Indranil Kaur, to inaugurate the program. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Aditi. Good evening to you all. It is a wonderful occasion when Surendranath College has completed successfully 4 webinar series in the last few days, that is between 15th to 18th of June, under the stressed lockdown condition. Today, we would like to launch our Star College under the Star DBT, Department of Biotechnology Star College scheme, which has been awarded to Zoology, Chemistry, Botany, and Physics departments of our college by the Government of India. Under this banner, today we'll be having the International Faculty Enrichment Program. Today we have Dr. Akash Chakraborty, Associate Editor of Springerwald, who is from Heidelberg, Germany. He will be talking on the tips and tricks of publishing in international scientific journals. And the topic seems to be very interesting, and that is how we have almost 920 participants till last night who have registered in our platform. It is really interesting that we have so many faculty members, researchers, and research students who have shown interest in this international webinar. Hoping to have a very interesting session and enriching experience with Akash. Now I request our faculty member, Dr. Aditi Sarvagaf of Zoology Department of our college, to introduce Dr. Akash. Over to you, Aditi.
Thank you, sir. Let me introduce Akash to you all, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Akash Chakraborty is an associate publishing editor or in physics editorial department at Springer. He obtained his PhD in condensed matter physics from Institut Nil, CNRS, Grenoble, France. Following which, he was employed as an early stage researcher in Karlsruhe University for Technology, Karlsruhe and Jacobs University, Bremen, Germany. And then as postdoctoral researcher at the University of Regensburg in Germany. His research primarily focused on magnetic properties of disordered systems and their application in emerging field of spintronics. During his brief research career, he has published in journals belonging to the American Physical Society, IOP Publishing, Springer, and Elsevier. At Springer, he is responsible for managing and developing a portfolio of journals, especially within the complex systems and network science domain. Over to you, Akash.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and yeah, thanks to all of you for having me here today. And inviting me to give this webinar. Very good afternoon to all of you. I hope that I am audible. And honestly, actually, I would have liked to, really preferred to have this session live. So have a real seminar and not a webinar, because I really like this session to be interactive, so to say, where you can actually interact with the crowd, with the audience, engage the audience, and and get to see your reactions, understand your opinions. But unfortunately, of course, yeah, we all know we are living under difficult and unprecedented times. So I really hope that we'll make the best use of this opportunity, and we're going to enjoy this. So just let me share my screen first, and yeah, okay. I'm just going to turn off my video for now, and we'll come back to it towards the end. Okay, I hope that this is fine. Okay, I would really like to request all the participants to please turn off your videos, all right? Otherwise, your videos keep popping up on my screen. So that'd be really nice if you could kindly turn off your respective videos, all right? Thanks. Okay, so let's just jump into it. So let me tell you, yeah, I'll try to cover this within an hour. Hopefully I'll succeed, and then we'll possibly leave us a bit of room towards the end for taking some questions, which I am given to understand that, yeah, we've already received quite a few. So yeah, let's get started. So of course, let me tell you that this, okay, yeah, so the key message, the primary message of this entire webinar, or the workshop, whatever you call it, is not only how to get published, okay, not only how to get published in scientific journals, but the idea is also how do you create an impact, okay? So how do you make an impact, and how do you really make your work visible? Okay, so in order to do that, there are three key things that one has to keep in mind. Of course, the first one is you need to have a very good manuscript, a structured, well-structured manuscript. The second is you need to have a very good publication strategy, which involves picking the right journal, the most appropriate journal for your work, for your paper. And lastly, it's about guiding yourself through the submission system. Okay, the journal submission system. So now we're going to look at these three aspects in the course of the next hour or so. Okay, I'm not sure I can change my slides easily. Okay, so the first thing is, of course, talking about the manuscripts. Of course, I guess most of you might have already had experience writing or publishing papers in scientific journals. Before I really get into the details of this this topic, let me just tell you one quick thing. This is not about publishing reviews, all right? This whole webinar, this whole talk is not designed at all to address issues of review writing. We're not talking about review articles here. We're not talking about writing, how to write reviews here, okay? Because I guess we have received a few questions on that. So this is only about writing primary research articles or original research articles. If you have specific questions to reviews, we can come back to that at the end. All right, so what do you need to have a good manuscript? Of course, you have to remember that your readers, so your target readers, your audience, they have four key questions, all right? So the first one is, of course, what was the primary reason behind your study? What was the motivation? Why did you do it exactly? The second question is, of course, what did you exactly do? The third question is that what did you actually discover? What were your findings? And the fourth question is that, of course, how does your study, how does your work actually contribute to the existing body of knowledge in the scientific literature? Okay, so what is the significance and what is the contribution of your work? Now, in order to address these four key questions, ideally your manuscript should be divided into 4 sections. Okay, so the introduction, methods, results, and discussions. We call it the IMRAD model. And these 4 major sections should ideally address these 4 key questions, which need to be answered in your manuscript. Okay, now we're going to look at each one of these 4 sections in a bit more detail here. Okay, fine. So the first question, as I said, is that what was the reason behind your studies? Okay, so what motivated you to do the study, do what you did? Exactly, what was the reason behind? Now, talking about the introduction, we'll say that we like to think of it as an inverted triangle, okay, as you can probably see on the left-hand side of the screen. So what does it mean? Basically, it signifies that you start off broad and then you gradually narrow down your readers to the specific goals or the specific aims of your study, okay? So you always start off with giving a background of the topic. Of course, you give a context of the study. When you're talking about that, it's also very important to keep in mind the kind of journal you are going to submit in, all right? So we're going to, of course, talk about it in the second part, choosing the right journal. But it's very important when you're writing the introduction, especially you're starting off the introduction, what kind of journal are you submitting in or you plan to submit in? So if it's a very, let's say, a very broad scope journal, okay, in that case, it's always advisable, it's better to give a very let's say a wide introduction, okay? So because the readers of the journal are from different backgrounds, they might not be very familiar with what's happening or what has happened, what has been studied in your that particular field. So it's better to, if you give a relatively wide context, a broad context, okay? But on the other hand, if you're submitting your paper, or you wish to submit your paper in a very specific journal, okay, a very subject-specific journal, in that case, you need not to give a very wide introduction. You can assume, you can safely assume, let's say, that the readers of that journal are more or less familiar with the background, with the history of that particular topic. So once you done about that, of course, you always have to state what has already been done, or what has been studied, what has been found. Okay, and while doing that, the second part of the introduction, while you're writing about it, please ensure that you always cite up-to-date studies, and you cite what broadly. Okay, so what does it mean? So it means that you should not restrict yourselves to citing papers from your group, or maybe your lab, or your institute, or your organization where you're working. Okay, because these things really count when your paper goes for review. At the same time, you also have to ensure that you only cite relevant studies. Just don't cite papers for the sake of citing them, or for the sake of increasing your own citations or your colleagues' citations. Okay, if a paper deserves to be cited, if it's relevant, you make sure that you cite them. It doesn't really matter, of course, how new or how old that particular paper is. It's also very advisable that when you're writing the introduction, you try to cite as many review articles as possible, okay? Because it's better to cite review articles rather than writing a very long and tedious introduction, which is most of the cases is not necessary. Because the advantage of citing review articles is that if the readers, if they're interested to know more about the topic, they can always go back and refer to those articles, okay? So they can read more in detail, more in depth, okay? So once you are done introducing the topic, of course, that leads you to the fact that what has not been studied, or what is the unknown factor. Okay, so this will definitely, so what is, when you're talking about the unknown factor, or the unknown aspect of the topic, of the problem, that will lead you directly to the specific goal or the objective of your work. Okay, and when you're talking about the aims or the objective of your study, please make sure that it's clearly the problem that you wish to identify, or you wish to address in the rest of your manuscript is clearly highlighted. So the question that you're going to address in your paper is clearly understood, as well as the fact that the aims or the objective, the goal of your study, it directly relates. Okay, so the arrow here, it basically is meant to indicate that it should directly relate to the problem. Your aim or your objective should relate to the problem which you have identified, which you have said that this has not been studied or not been done. It's not always necessary that you will be working on something completely new. Let's say it might as well be that it often happens in science that there are a lot of let's say long-standing controversies. Of course, there are debates over certain things which have not been settled or which have not been clarified. It can also be about that. So whatever the question, whatever the problem that you are going to address or you're going to discuss about in the rest of your paper has to be very clearly outlined towards the end of your introduction, so that the reader is very clear on the question, on the objective of your work, okay? So once you're done addressing the first key question, that will of course lead you to the second question, which is that what do you exactly do? All right, so now I'll tell you that why is this section, so the section on the methods or methodology, why is it important, okay? And then I'll tell you what we exactly look for, or what you should exactly write in the method section. So first of all, it's very important for the researchers in your field, okay? So researchers working in your field or even in related fields, because this is the part, this is the section of your manuscript which contains the information which the readers or the other researchers will find useful if they want to reproduce your work, okay? And it's very important, remember, especially in science, that your findings, your research is reproducible, okay? Because we say that if your results are not, if your work is not reproducible, it's not credible, okay? It loses credibility, okay? And at the same time, if people are not able to reproduce your results, I mean, obviously they will lose interest and they will not be able to build on what you have done, okay? So what happens is your paper easily and very rapidly loses significance, okay? So after a few years or so, people will stop reading it, or will stop working on it, or even stop citing it. So remember the key message, right, which I said right at the beginning. So it's not only about publishing, but it's also about making sure that your work is read and creating an impact with your work, okay? So now the second reason why this method section is also very important is for the peer reviewers, okay? So your paper, once you submit it in a journal and it goes for reviews to the reviewers, this is the first section actually which the reviewers really carefully read, okay? So they really want to ensure, the reviewers, the referees, they want to ensure that you have really used the right tools and the right techniques for your work. If they realize, if the reviewer thinks or believes that you've used methods or tools which are outdated, okay, or which are not, let's say, not directly relevant or applicable to the study that you're doing, in that case, the reviewer will never be, let's say, inclined to recommend your paper for publication. Okay, so that's why you have to make sure that you provide all the necessary details in the method section here. So now let's see what we exactly what we are looking for, what you should contain in the method section. So of course, you always start with the samples, kind of the samples of the materials that you are using. Okay, the word participants here, of course, is used to indicate it's relevant for the researchers in, let's say, life sciences or biology. I guess there are some here. So when you're talking about your samples or materials, make sure that you provide as much details as possible, whatever relevant details is possible. So, okay, if it was, where did you acquire it from? Where did you get it from? Where was it? Was it fabricated in-house? Did you really fabricate in your lab, or did you get it from, let's say, a commercial supplier? Is there any characteristic property of those samples of those materials? Also, the sample size is very important. The size in terms of, it could be the length and breadth as well. It could also be, if you're doing a survey-like study, it could also be the sample size of your pool. Participants here, of course, would refer to those researchers who are working with animals, let's say, or even live patients. Okay, it's very important that you have the necessary ethical clearances, you have the consent, okay, and you follow all the ethical standards. This is something which is very, very important, and I'll come back to it later when we talk about ethics in publishing. Okay, so that's the first part. The second thing, of course, is you obviously, you're talking about your methods. You have to discuss the tools and techniques that you're using. Here, I'd like to point out something. When you're talking about the tools and techniques, or your setup, or your instrument, or whatever that is, it's very important to understand that you don't really always have to go into the details or in the working principles of the tools that you're using. Okay, so especially for those of you who are doing experiments, let's say, okay, I mean, if you're using something like a spectrophotometer or a transmission electron microscope, you don't really have to go into the details of the working principles of how a transmission electron microscope actually works. Okay, so it's well established, it's used worldwide. So I think more or less everyone knows how a transmission electron microscope works, and nobody's interested. But on the other hand, if you're using a setup or an instrument or an experimental setup, which was, let's say, built in-house, okay, it was built in your lab or in your group or in your institute, and you know that there are only very few people or very few groups across the world who are using it. So in that case, it's always advisable that you actually describe the details, okay, the details of your setup. It's very important. Also, when talking about the tools and the methods, it's very important here to talk about the specific conditions and controls, okay? So this is extremely important here because, as I said in the previous slide, about the reproducibility of your work, okay? So if you think that you might as well think that, okay, these little details are not really relevant to your work, to your study, so it's not important to mention them, you are mistaken, okay? Specific conditions and controls are extremely important, especially when people are trying to reproduce your work. They are actually trying to do the same experiment or do the same calculations. Okay, it's not always about experiments. It can also be about, let's say, numerical calculations or computational stuff. If you're using any algorithms, if you're using truncation methods, if you're using approximation methods, make sure that you clearly identify them, clearly highlight them. Also, when it comes to experiments, you have to really make sure that you clearly specify if there were any like temperature conditions or pressure conditions or anything else which is actually directly relevant to your results, which were directly led to the results that you've obtained. All right. And lastly, of course, you talk about if you are using, that is, if you're using any software or quantification methods for analyzing your data, analyzing your tests, please clearly identify which kind of software you're using. Is this a freely available software? Is it an open source software? Or is it a commercial software? Okay, how did you access it? So these kind of details are always very helpful. And if you are in doubts, so what we always suggest is that, you know, I mean, especially now that people have a lot of data and people work with a lot of data, it might as well happen that you are not very sure of, you have a lot of data, but you're not sure how exactly to interpret it or how exactly, let's say, portray it, okay, depict it in your work. So in those kind of cases, it's always advisable that you consult a professional statistician, okay, because a statistician can always give you ideas or suggestions as to what would be the best way to show your results, okay, to kind of like plot them or depict them or interpret them or whatever exactly that you want to do. All right. Okay, so that I think is about the method section. So that will, of course, bring us to the next key question, That is, what did you find? Okay, so the third key question which the readers have is that what did you exactly find? What were your discoveries? And when it comes to that, I mean, I'd like to take a bit of time here to mention that it's very important when you're discussing your results, okay, you're rather talking about your results, you have to remember that what you have done is apparently simple to you, okay? It might appear very simple to you because obviously you have done it, you know the topic, you know the experiment, or know the study in and out. But when an outsider, when a third person is reading it, it's not very obvious, it's not very simple for the person, okay, for the other person, for the reader. So what we suggest, what we always advise here in the case is that you should always go in a very logical and sequential manner, okay? So it means that you discuss one figure at a time, okay? And it's also advisable, highly advisable, I would say, to break down the section, the results section, into subsections or subparagraphs, okay? And you always clearly start these smaller paragraphs. If possible, of course, you can give a small subheading. It's not mandatory, but if you're giving a subheading, it's fine, it's good. But if you're not, or if you don't really have the chance or scope to do that, it's always advisable to start these small sections or small paragraphs with key phrases or words like figure 1 shows that, in figure 2 we see that, figure 3 depicts that, so that the reader exactly knows where to look, okay? So that there is a one-to-one correspondence between what I'm reading and where I have to look, okay? So what should I relate to? Also, please avoid jumping between figures. When you're talking about the results, you should always try avoiding jumping between the figures, okay? So if you're talking about figure 1, try to talk about figure 1, don't go to figure 2, or don't refer to figure 3, and then again come back to figure 2 or come back to figure 1. So if you do that, what happens is the reader gets confused, okay? And if the reader gets confused, the reader loses interest and will obviously not be inclined to read the rest of your paper. And okay, and it also doesn't make for a very good reading if you do that. So that's why what we always say is the key message here is avoid information overload, okay? So try to give the information in a very sequential manner so that the readers make it easier for the readers to follow and to understand, okay? So it becomes, if you do it, if you present it one by one in a sequence, in a logical way, it only facilitates the understanding of your results, okay? So now talking about the figures, of course, I mean, yeah, we have the, I mean, this is something I also like to talk about, actually stress about here, is the figure captions, okay? The figure captions, what we say here, the figure captions or figure legend, whatever you call it, they should be ideally self-descriptive, okay? Self-descriptive or standalone. So what does it mean? So it means that the caption or the legend of the figure itself should contain ample information as to what the figure shows and what the figure contains. Okay, this is also very important, especially now that, you know, like we have a flurry of papers being published. A lot of researchers don't really have the time to go and read each and every paper in detail. Okay, so what often researchers and academics, they do is that they just flip through the pages, they look at your figure, and they just read the caption. Okay, so what is the, okay, if the figure looks interesting, let's look at the caption. What does it say? Okay, what is the key message here? So in order to do that, you really have to provide a as clearly descriptive figure caption as possible, okay? Also make sure that if you are using any kind of, let's say, different kind of symbols, as you can see in this particular figure on the bottom right-hand corner, if you're using different colors, different symbols, let's say circles, squares, triangles to depict different things, or even different kinds of lines, like that, dotted lines, dashed lines, solid lines, you make sure that these are clearly indicated in the caption. What do those symbols and what do those different kind of lines they stand for? What do they signify? Also, if you're using any kind of abbreviations inside the figures, we often see that people use abbreviations, okay? Make sure that those abbreviations are clearly labeled in the figure caption, okay? Because you need not have to worry about the length of those captions, because it's never, I mean, as far as I know, I've never seen any journal having a word limit on the figure caption, on the figure legend. So you should never really worry about that. And that's why it should really, it gives you actually a lot of freedom to write as much as you want, okay? So also about the abbreviations, as I said, if you're using abbreviations and acronyms, try to make them clear, try to describe them already in the caption so that the reader, you know, doesn't have to go back to the text and or rather hunt in the text that, okay, there is something called ABC in the caption here, but it doesn't really, I don't really know what this ABC stands for. And then it has to go back into the text and hunt for it. Okay, so you have to make it as easily comprehensible for the reader as possible. All right. And talking about the figures themselves now, of course, it's very, very important that you try to make or plot or draw or whatever clearly legible figures. Okay, so it means that what you have plotted on the y-axis or the x-axis here should be clearly visible. Okay, so it shouldn't be like as if the reader will have to use a magnifying glass to actually see that what have you written on the x-axis or what have you plotted, what are the numbers on the y-axis. Okay, because that doesn't really add to the weight of your paper. Also, it's also not about the labeling. It's also about marking the axis. Okay, so of course you're plotting physical quantities or some kind of quantities on the axis when you're making figures. The other thing that we see a problem that we often see from time to time is that a physical quantity is plotted on the x-axis. Let's say, let's say frequency, for example. But yeah, it's just frequency. So we don't know the units. Okay, so units are not mentioned. Okay, so we don't know. Okay, so is it frequency in what? Is it hertz, millihertz, terahertz? Okay, temperature, only temperature. Okay, so is it centigrade, Kelvin, Fahrenheit? Okay, so don't do those things, because of course it doesn't mean that if you don't write your figure captions or the labeled axis clearly or put the correct units, your paper will be rejected. But of course it doesn't reflect very well on the way that you have prepared your manuscript. Okay, so what I would suggest is that take some time. Okay, spend some time while making your figures. Okay, so do it nicely. I mean, especially nowadays, it's not a big deal to make good figures, to draw good figures, especially all the tools and the softwares that you have at your disposal. Of course, if it was like 15, 20 years ago, I would have still understood. But of course, it's not really a difficult task to make a nice figure, a clear figure. And of course, I guess as you all must be knowing, that figures do really add a lot of importance and significance to your paper, to your manuscript. Okay. So that, I think, is what I would like to tell you about. Yeah, so the third key question, which is of course the readers have, that is what have you found, what were your findings. And once you have done that, that brings you to the last section, so the last key question, which was like, how was your study, how is your study relevant, or how does it help to grow the field? What contribution does it make to the field? Okay, so like now in this case, as you can see, I mean, yeah, there is it's quite the opposite, the inverse of the introduction. All right, so in the introduction, if you remember, I said that it's like an inverted triangle where you start off broad and then you gradually narrow down to your specific objectives. Here, it's about you start off narrow and then you gradually broaden down to your general conclusions and then with the implications. Okay, so of course, when you start to write the discussion section, you should always summarize. Okay, begin with the summarizing very briefly in 1 or 2 sentences. What was the research problem? Okay, so what was the problem that you wanted to address? And also just briefly talk about the most important findings. Don't talk about everything because you've already talked about your results. So just stress on the most important findings, the key findings of your work. And then the most important part of the discussion section, the most important the aspect of your discussion section is the interpretation. Okay, so of course you have got some nice results, you have plotted some nice figures, but what does it all mean? Okay, so what does it all lead to, or what is the scientific significance of all that? So here, when you're talking about interpretations, or writing about the interpretations of your results, of your findings, it's very important that you highlight or stress on the similarities and differences, of course, if any, you have found with previously published work. If you have found, if your results are similar to what was already published or what has already been obtained, that's perfectly fine, that's good. Okay, but if you find something different, okay, if you discover something different, or you're reporting something different which different to what has already been published or what has already been studied, in that case, it's not just enough to say that, oh yes, we found this, and this is in contrast to what was reported in this paper published in this year. Okay, that's really not enough. If you find something different, you always have to make sure that you give a proper scientific explanation, a plausible scientific explanation as to why your results are different from those which were already published or which were already reported. Okay, so I understand that it might be that, and at times it can happen, that you cannot really pinpoint the exact reason as to the origin of those differences. Okay, but even then you should always try to give a hand-waving, plausible, scientifically plausible argument. This is why we believe, or this might be the probable reason of the differences that we see, or the difference that we have observed. Okay, because if you just say that this is something different which we have observed compared to what was studied earlier, it just means that, okay, you did it, but you really don't understand what you have done, okay, or what we have obtained through your results that you have found. Okay, so the next important point is, of course, as we always say, negative results are also results. So please don't try to conceal them. Don't try to hide information or conceal information, because remember, if your paper goes for review, I mean, if it goes to the reviewers, they are experts. They're usually subject experts. So at some point of time, somebody or the other will most likely figure out or point out that, okay, that there were some results, that there is some discrepancy in what you have mentioned, and this is not exactly what you should have found or what you should have obtained. Okay, so there is absolutely no reason as to why you should be afraid, or you should be scared, or let's say you should be embarrassed of highlighting something unexpected or something negative, something which you didn't really expect when you started off doing the study, doing your calculations or your experiment. It's a negative result. Okay, still a result. Remember, as I said, it might help others or even yourself a few years later when you actually look back and come back to your study and start, like maybe you figure out another way or another solution to work on it. So of course, that's why it's important that we always say that negative results should also be reported. There should be a scientific account of those. And of course, limitations. I mean, yes, limitations, it's not always obvious that you will have limitations or you will know the limitations. So what we mean by limitations are here mostly limitations imposed by, let's say, your resources, okay? So if I give you a very a vague example, I would say that, you're working in low temperature or with cryogenic systems, and you really want to study the property of a system which you're interested in, let's say at 5 Kelvin. But you have a cryogenic setup which can only go down to 50 Kelvin. Okay, so obviously the properties that you're going to get at 50 Kelvin is not going to be the same which you would obtain at 5 Kelvin, all right? But it doesn't mean that the properties or the observations, the results which you obtain at 50 Kelvin, they are not valid or they are not scientifically significant. So if you have any kind of these limitations or restrictions imposed by whatever factor that might be, you should always state them clearly here when you're talking about your results. Okay, so this has two advantages. Of course, the first, it shows that it tells the readers as well as the reviewers that you really understand your topic, you understand your subject, you understand very well what you're doing. And the other thing is that you're also very frank and honest about reporting your work. Okay, so that's why it always works. And remember, if you state your limitations, it doesn't work to your disadvantage, rather it helps. Okay, it will only help your manuscript. Okay, so, and that, of course, once you have done that, that will bring you to the last part of the discussion, so which you can, of course, often write as a separate section with a conclusion heading. Or if you're not writing it with a separate heading under conclusion, you should always, if you're writing it as a continuation of the discussion section, it's always advisable that you separate it into a clear paragraph. Okay, you write the conclusion as a paragraph, and what we call, you should always start off with something like with phrases, key phrases, like in conclusion, to conclude, to summarize. Okay, so like these markers. So you flag it that, so that the readers clearly know that this is the last paragraph. This is the last part of the work that I'm reading. Okay, and it's also very important, the conclusion, the concluding paragraph of your manuscript, because remember, this is something which the readers are going to read at the very end. Okay, and hence this is also something which is more likely going to remain with the reader. So this is where you have the maximum chance of actually creating an impact and making sure that you state what was the most important finding, the most important result, and the main conclusion of your work. Okay, so that the readers clearly understand that, okay, you have done a lot of things, you have used a lot of interesting tools and techniques, you have found some nice results. It has, of course, some interesting relevance and interpretations, but what do we actually learn from it? Okay, what do we actually take from it? Okay, so that's why this part is very, very important, the concluding section or the concluding paragraph of your work. And you should always try to finish off the conclusion with the future implications of your work, of course, if that is possible. Okay, so what does it lead to, or what you think, what you believe as the author, as an author, as like doing the study, what do you think would lead to in the future, or what could be done to build on it, or what could be done to improve it for, let's say, if you're an experimentalist and you know that there are no theoretical studies on that particular topic. So you can always suggest, like, it would be interesting to look at it from the theoretical point of view, or theoretical studies in these experiment or in this field. On the other hand, if you're a theoretician and you know that you don't have any, solid experimental studies to back your theoretical claim, you can always suggest the study for experimentalists or future experiments that would be interesting to conduct or perform future experiments on this study so as to confirm your results. Okay, so this is what we mean by implications, that what is the future direction. Okay, so where does your study, okay, it's not only about the contribution you make, it's not only about what we learn from this work, but what does this study lead to, where does it lead to? Okay, so this is what more or less, I think, if you can address these key points here, so you will be successful in writing a very, let's say, a very concrete and comprehensible discussion. Okay. I hope that, yeah, I'm audible, because that's one of the disadvantages of a webinar. I can't really see that if you're listening or if you're sleeping. Yeah, okay, anyway. Right, moving on.
No,
So
you're perfectly audible. Akash, you're
okay.
perfectly audible.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, sometimes my slides are getting stuck. Okay, good. So let's summarize here. So now, in addition to answering these 4 key questions, of course, that we already mentioned, so you see on the left-hand side here, it's also very important what we say is, to link your ideas throughout the manuscript, okay? So there has to be a coherence, okay? There has to be a connection. So what we always say is, try to think of your manuscript as a story. Okay, so it's a story that has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. Okay, and there is a connection. So there should be a clear flow, it has to be a connection, and there has to be a link. Okay, so it should not appear that your introduction is one story, your results, methods and results is one story, and the discussion is another story. Okay, so remember that you have identified a problem, so you had posed a question towards the end of your introduction. So the readers want that question to be answered at the end of the story. Okay, so that's why it's very important that the implications or the main findings of your work, they are directly related to the problem that you had identified, or the objectives that you had identified, you had set out right at the beginning. Okay, similarly, your results and figures, as you can see here, the results, your findings, basically, they should be related to the objective that you had outlined, that, okay, we want to do this, we want to show this, or we want to prove this. Okay, and this is what you always should try to relate or try to connect. And similarly, this I already told in the beginning in the introduction slide, that your objectives or your specific aims should be directly related or connected to the problem that you had identified, the unknown factor. All right. So if you succeed in answering the key questions in all these, the 4 key questions, and in addition, you are able to kind of like coherently link all your ideas throughout the manuscript, I would say that you have been successful in writing an almost perfect manuscript. Okay. So now once you're done with that and you're happy with that, of course, so you have a story, but your story also needs a name. Okay. So you come to that brings us to the title, of course. So now the title is also a very important part of your manuscript, because of course this is the first thing which readers read, okay, they look at. And this is the chance where you actually get to grab the reader's attention, okay? So that's why getting the title right is very, very important for any scientific paper, okay? So here we're going to just I'm going to tell you a few key points that you should keep in mind, okay, while writing the title or framing the title of your paper. So if you look at the left-hand box here, so of course, what the things that we should include, we should try to include always, of course, obviously, what's important about the work, the most important aspect of your work. Secondly, very important, keywords, okay? So keywords, the most relevant keywords of your work. Okay, so why is it important? Because nowadays, as you know, with all those like thousands of papers getting published in all the databases, okay, available, so people go on these databases or even on Google, and people look for papers, mostly search for papers by keywords. If you are not, so the disadvantage is that if you're not using the right keywords, if you're not inducting the right keywords into the title, so your paper, your manuscript, even if it's accepted or published, they will never show up in these searches. Okay, so even if they don't show up in your searches, obviously your chances of getting read will decrease. Okay, so that's why it's always very important that you try to incorporate all the relevant keywords, the most important keywords. Okay, you might not be able to incorporate all of them, but at least try to incorporate as many as you can, the keywords into your title. Okay, and lastly, and very importantly, keep it short. Okay, so please keep it short. Don't write titles which run into 3-4 lines. It's really not a good idea. Okay, so don't go by the number of words here. It's just an indicator. So I mean, it's not as if, like if you write a title, if your title goes more than 20 words, it's not acceptable or it's not good. It's just an indicator. But the general thumb rule is that you try to keep it as short as you can. Keep it brief. Okay. Because if you write it long, the problem is that when readers or researchers, they're searching for these articles on these online databases, and they see a paper which have a title which runs into several lines, of course, they lose interest, okay? And they just move on to the next one. It doesn't help, okay? So just keep it short as you can, all right? And what are the things that you should not include? Okay, first thing, never ever ask questions, okay? Let me tell you, it's a terrible idea. The readers, remember the readers, they are full of questions. Okay, so they don't want more questions, they're looking for answers. So never pose a question in the title of your manuscript. Okay, Secondly, don't go into describing the details of the methods or the tools that you're using, because if you do that, you will end up with a title which runs into 3 or 4 lines. Not advisable. You have the entire method section to talk about that. So do not, it's not at all a good idea if you talk about, if you want to actually describe or label an entire method which you have used in your study. Not at all relevant, all right? And abbreviations, of course, this is a little tricky, I would say, because it really depends on the type of journal, once again, you're submitting in, okay? So I would say that, you know, if you're submitting in a very wide, broad scope journal, it's not advisable to use abbreviations, okay? Because as I said, the readers can be from a wide background, okay, a very broad background. So they might not be familiar with very technical terms or technical abbreviations or acronyms which are used specifically in your field. But then again, if you're using, or rather if you're publishing or you wish to submit in journal which is very specific, okay, very specific to your topic, to your subject, to your area of work, in that case, I would say that it's okay. I mean, you know, it's perfectly fine to use abbreviations. And, you know, like if I give you an example, I mean, I was asked this, I mean, okay, I can't really, I like to ask questions, you know, like when I'm doing this, because so that I get to understand what you're feeling. So if somebody asks me, what does SHM stand for? Okay, I can also ask you, but obviously I'm not going to get the answer now. But the first thing, if somebody asks me, what does SHM mean? So the first thing that strikes me is simple harmonic motion. It's obvious because I come from a physics background. Okay, so all along, I mean, I have learned that SHM stands for simple harmonic motion. All right, that's perfectly fine. But if you ask a civil engineer or even a mechanical engineer, what does SHM mean? They might answer structural health monitoring. Okay, so which is absolutely fine. Okay, because it's a different thing. It's a very commonly used. I'm not sure if there are any civil engineers here listening, or mechanical engineers for that matter. Structural health monitoring is, you know, like the study of the detection of faults and cracks in structures. Okay, like in big buildings or in bridges. Okay, so what I mean to say is that, yeah, SHM can mean one thing to me, can mean something to an engineer, can mean also an entirely different thing to a biologist. I have no idea. So if you're submitting in a very multidisciplinary broad focus journal, don't use abbreviations in the title. But again, if you're submitting it in a specific journal, it's perfectly fine, I would say. Okay, so in short, what is your title should basically be a short and crisp summary of what is the most important aspect of your work, all right? Right, so once you have the titles, the next thing obviously is the, okay, my slides are getting stuck, is the abstract, okay? So of course the abstract is a very important, once again, very important aspect of your paper, because this is the first time that the readers, they get a very good first impression of your work, okay, of your entire research. So, and ideally the abstract should be able to summarize the importance of your aims, the significance of your results, and the relevance of your conclusions. And more importantly, why is the abstract very important, and what does it really mean? Because it really indicates, or rather shows the readers the clarity in your writing. Okay, so your writing skills. Usually I like to talk a bit about this, but I don't think we have a lot of time today. But when it comes to writing, scientific writing especially, let me tell you that, you know, there are a few tips I would say. That the first thing is, please write short and simple sentences. Okay, remember, this is not an essay writing competition. Don't use fancy English words. It will not help you, trust me. Okay, so this is not English literature or philosophy. You're writing science. So keep it simple, keep it short. Do not try to write long compound sentences, because if you don't really have a good grasp or good command over the language, you will invariably end up making mistakes, making errors while writing. So try to write very short, simple sentences, use simple tenses and simple words, okay, so that it becomes easily comprehensible. All right. So what should your abstract contain? Of course, what do the readers want to know? So again, so it's basically the 4 key questions which I'd already highlighted right in the beginning, remember? So the reasons behind your study, so what did you exactly do and what you found? And of course, how does it contribute to your field? So it's basically what the abstract is a very concise summary, a short summary of your entire work. All right, so I'm not going to go into the details again because you already know. So of course, yeah, try to ensure that don't make it too long. So just, you know, write 1 or 2 sentences about the problem, 1 or 2 sentences, just briefly describe your methods or tools you use, and only summarize the important findings. Okay, just the key findings. Don't go about talking about all the results that you have obtained, all the figures that you have found, everything. Not important. And of course, try to finish the abstract with the most important conclusion. Okay, the take-home message, which readers can learn. What can we learn? What the readers can learn from your work? Okay, so what is advisable here is, that's why we always say, that try to write the abstract at the very end. Okay, so write your paper first. Okay, prepare the draft, write it twice, thrice until you're really happy and completely satisfied with what you have, and then only then you should think about writing the abstract, because you have your entire manuscript in front of you. You can see everything. You have the introduction, the results, the methods, the discussion, all of it, and that will give you all the ideas. All the information is basically contained there, what you need to write a good abstract. Okay, and once again, as I said, so try to be clear and try to use short, simple sentences. Okay, simple language. Don't really try to impress the readers writing fancy English words, okay, or complicated sentences. It's not at all a good idea. Okay, so that I think will bring us to the second part. Of course, we need, of course, you have a paper, so you need to have a good journal for it. So of course we want to publish quickly. Of course everyone wants to publish quickly, and as I said, the key message here is that we wish to have an impact. We want to make an impact with your work. So the two things that need to be taken care of here is, of course, choosing the most suitable journal for your work, the right journal for your work, and secondly is, of course, you have to communicate the importance and the relevance of your work to the journal editor. Okay, that's also very important, and we'll come to that in the last part. Here, actually, I like to take a pause and usually I ask a question to the audience. Is that so of course, we are discussing it after the first section, after the manuscript preparation writing section. But I'd like to ask always, what I usually always ask is that, what do you think that which is a good idea, which is preferable? Is it better to write the manuscript and then pick a journal? Or is it better to maybe choose a journal and then go about writing your manuscript? Okay, so I usually ask a live audience, and I try to get an opinion, a poll, let's say. Okay, but anyway, since I don't have the option here, I'll go ahead and give you the answer. So of course, the second option is advisable, and that's what we recommend. So which is, of course, you try to pick a journal, okay, choose a journal, and then you go about writing the manuscript, okay? Because the advantage is that if you don't do that, okay, so instead what you do is you've written your draft, you've written the manuscript, and then you go about picking a journal, you realize that, okay, so this journal doesn't really accept those kind of article type that you have written. So it doesn't really meet, let's say, the journal has some restrictions. So it doesn't meet the requirements, the word limit or the page limit or the figure limit. Okay, so then you would have to go back to your manuscript and start rewriting it all over again. So that's why it's advisable that you actually pick a journal first, all right, okay, or at least have a couple of similar journals in mind, and then you go about writing the manuscript, okay, so that it also gives you an idea what exactly the journal publishes, what kind of articles it publishes, if there are any, like writing styles, if there are any word limits, figure limits, whatever that is. So of course, the next question is, this is also something which I like to ask, is that if you really think that is it the journal which is with the highest impact factor that you should consider, okay? So the answer is not necessarily, of course not. I mean, so you should always target a journal. As I said, remember, the idea here is to make an impact, okay? It's not only about getting published, but it's also about making an impact with your work, okay? So that your work is read and your work is cited, okay? So that people remember your work, okay? So of course, it's not a good idea to, most of the times I would say, to pick the journal with the highest impact factor or a very high impact factor, because what happens is in the process, you might lose a lot of time, all right? Because most of these very high impact factor journals, as you probably know, have a very high rejection rate, okay? So more than 70 to 80% of the papers submitted in these journals are rejected, okay? So that's why it's not very advisable, because you might lose a lot of time going after these impact factor journals, where you would actually save a lot of time and succeed in publishing if you had chosen the right journal, the most appropriate one for your work, okay? So of course, the idea here is that you should always pick a journal, choose a journal that will help to reach out to the maximum audience, okay, the maximum readership, so that you can ensure that only the people, the relevant people, okay, the people who would be interested in your work, they are reading your work, they are reading your paper, so that, they find it interesting, they find it relevant, and they build on it or they cite it, okay? And since we're talking about impact factor, I don't know how many of you, I think it was also one of the questions I remember that somebody had asked that, what was the impact factor, or how do you determine the impact factor in a very concrete manner? So this is the standard formula which is used, okay, to determine the impact factor of any journal, all right? So it basically counts the number of, if you see at the bottom of the screen, I hope it's legible. It's basically a ratio, of course. So the numerator has the total number of citations received by the publications of that journal in the preceding 2 years. and it's divided by the total number of citable items published by that journal, again in the preceding 2 years. So what we mean by citable items here, it's very important that it's not everything published in a journal is citable, okay? So citable items, of course, they exclude like editorials or letters to the editor, comments from the editor, meeting abstracts, book reviews, or anything of that sort, okay? So these things are always excluded when an impact factor of a journal is analyzed, or rather calculated, okay? All right, so then how do you actually choose a journal? So, okay, there are some like key things, key points which one can keep in mind when it comes to choosing the right journal. Of course, where do you think your findings are relevant? If you think that it's relevant for a global audience, you should always choose an international journal which has a global reach or worldwide reach. But of course, if you think that your results, your study is only relevant for a regional or a local audience, you should always pick a journal which has local reach, okay? So it might seem a little weird for some people that, you know, you might think that, okay, all the research we do is, of course, it's relevant worldwide, but not necessarily, okay? Because in terms of, in cases of, I know few people in civil engineering or even geological sciences, earth sciences, where certain studies are not really relevant for everyone in the world because they are really region focused, okay, specific to a particular region, a particular location, and people across the world, they might not be interested in it, all right? So that's one of the key questions that you have to remember when you're going about choosing the journal. The second thing, of course, where do you think which people would be interested? So if you think it's only researchers from your field who would be interested in knowing about your reading your works, of course, you should choose a very specific, a subject specific journal, which have, you know, like which are read only by researchers in your field. But if you think that it's not only researchers from your field, but it's also from other related fields, allied fields who would be interested or who could find your results interesting. So of course, you should always go for a broad focus and multidisciplinary journal, which has a wider reach and a wider readership, okay? And the next thing, of course, brings me to one of my favorite topics, is accessibility, okay? So how much accessibility you think is good or you would prefer for your paper, for your work? So if you think that it's fine if only researchers who have access to these subscription journals, okay, or who have access to these journals through institutions or organizations, it's fine if your work reaches them, then it's fine. You can always opt for the good old subscription-based journals, all right? But if you believe that your work should be freely available to everyone across the world, okay, the way to go is open access, okay? And I'm not sure how many of you are really familiar with the idea or the concept of open access publishing, because it's something which is really being talked about a lot nowadays, especially the last few years, I would say. Open access publishing is becoming more and more popular, increasingly popular. And I would say that, you know, I mean, I just somehow have the feeling that in the next 10 to 15 years, open access publishing will be one of the predominant modes of publishing, okay? So of course, open access publishing is something where, you know, your work upon acceptance, it becomes immediately and permanently available to everyone across the world. So what you only need is just a decent internet connection, all right? Decent internet connection and a device, okay? Be it a phone, a laptop, a tab, whatever that is. As long as you can connect to internet, you can read that article, you can download that article, that's it. Okay, but it's not only about free access. Open access also has a lot of other advantages. Like, of course, it helps to fulfill the mandates from institutions or funders. Okay, I wouldn't say that it applies so much in our country yet. It's not so much in India, but of course in the West, especially in Europe now, Western Europe, it's becoming increasingly, I would say, mandatory, obligatory for researchers to publish in open access journals. Okay, the funding agencies, the funders, they are making it mandatory for funded research, publicly funded research, to be published in open access journals. Of course, it increases accessibility, obviously, as I said, because it's freely accessible, freely downloadable. So then obvious consequence is that the number of downloads are much higher, and the direct consequence is that, of course, if the number of downloads are high, it's always more likely to be read and more likely to be cited. Okay, so according to the study we performed last year, I think sometime around 2018, I don't remember exactly, we found that open access articles are 1.6 times more likely to be cited than articles which are published in subscription journals, okay, so which are behind paywalls. Anyway, so the other advantage, of course, the big advantage with open access publishing is that you as authors, you retain the copyright of your work, okay? So unlike in subscription journals, you remember, those of you who have published will know that you have to sign a copyright transfer form, and that copyright is transferred to the publisher of the journal, okay, and you don't have the copyright anymore. But unlike that, in the case of open access, the copyright, of course, remains with you as the authors, okay? Online, it's of course, most open access journals are online only journals. There are no print open access journals. So that's why there is no waiting time for waiting to be published in the next issue or next volume or something like that. So of course, the publication time is relatively fast. And of course, since there are no print costs involved, there is always, I would say, lesser restrictions when it comes to figure limits and word limits. Okay. So these are some of the benefits, of course, but the problem now is that not all open access journals are good. All right. I don't know how many of you here have heard about predatory journals. Okay, I have heard about the term predatory journals or predatory publishing or predatory publishers, predatory open access publishing, because it's really a kind of a menace, I would say, in the publishing business. A lot of these journals, open access journals, they are actually fake. All right. So what they do is, so I'll just come to the slide later on. I'll just tell you what predatory journals and predatory publishers do. So what they do is of course, they're open access journals, and they have a very quick publication time. They have a very quick turnaround time. And they basically take advantage of, like I would say, naive authors or first time authors, and kind of entice them into publishing their papers very quickly. Like it can be within a week or even less. Of course, you have to pay a certain sum. As with all open access journals, you have to pay the APC, the article processing charges, the publishing fees. But then your article is, of course, what these predatory journals do, they don't follow any standard editorial and peer review processes. Okay, so there is absolutely no standards. There is no peer review. There is no vetting. And it's just published. So of course, they can publish these things very quickly online. They don't even have any impact factors. You might go to their website and find a very, like a very, let's say, relatively high and impressive impact factor. But let me tell you, they're all fake and they're mock impact factors. Okay, if you try to look for them on the journal citation reports, which actually list the impact factor of all journals, you will never find them. So of course, this is becoming an increasing problem, okay, with researchers, and especially young researchers and young authors, when it becomes difficult to spot them, okay, to identify.
We lost your voice, Akash.
Them. So what I really want to talk about, okay, a legitimate or a reliable. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, now you're audible. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just lost my internet connection for a second. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
sorry. For
sorry.
a second, yeah. Predatory journal till there, it was okay.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay, all right, that's good. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, let's see. Yeah, so we'll just talk about this. I hope this is fine. Yeah. So yeah, so we're right now you're on this slide where I was talking about. Okay, so how do you spot or identify a legitimate or reliable open access journal? All right, so of course, let me tell you before I go through this list, I mean, none of these, what you see on your screen right now, you see on this particular slide, is a foolproof way of identifying a legitimate open access journal, okay, or identifying, so to say, a predatory or a fake journal. Okay, so it's a bit I would say it's a bit like a detective work. Okay, so you really have to dig in, you have to look, you have to search. Okay, so the first thing, of course, you should look for is that if you can identify the name of the publisher. Okay, the name of the publisher. You go to the journal homepage and you clearly see if it belongs to any of the reputed publishers that you know, that you have heard of. Okay, second thing is, of course, the editorial board. Look at the names, but once again, this is not very sure-shot way of identifying, because most of these predatory journals, they have, like huge long lists of experts, like from all across the world, from the top institutes, from the top universities in the world, because obviously these people not even aware, the experts, they were not even aware that their names are there, their names are listed on the editorial board of these journals. Okay, so of course, then what you can always do is, if you happen to know some of them, or maybe you met some of them, some of these editorial board members at a conference or an event, you can always drop in a quick email and check with them that, hey, I found your name on this, like on this journal webpage. Are you really involved with this journal? Is it a good idea? I was thinking or planning of submitting my paper to this journal. What do you suggest, or what do you recommend? Okay, so that's one way of making sure, or like kind of verifying. Of course, the other thing is indexing. You should always go and check on the common databases that we use. There is something called the DOAJ. So the website is doaj.org. So it stands for Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ. And most, I would say not all, but most legitimate, most good recognized open access journals are listed on DOAJ. So of course, you can also look at the other databases like Web of Science and Scopus if these journals are indexed. But again, let me tell you that if the journal is not indexed on any of these standard databases, it doesn't mean that the journal is necessarily predatory or fake. Okay. Because what happens is, any journal to get indexed in any of these databases, it takes several years. Okay, so if we launch, let's say Sprengel launches a new journal today, it will be at least 2 or 3 years before it gets indexed in any of these databases. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if the journal is not on the database, it's always a fake journal or predatory journal, all right? Authors, okay, so you can always go back to the last published articles, because it's, and as I said, you know, like they're online, so they're all free to read. Go to the website, look at the last few articles, the list of articles that were published in that particular journal. Do you recognize any of the researchers who have published there? Okay, so does any of those names seem familiar to you? So if they do, okay, you might happen to know them, or they might be your colleagues, or you have met them somewhere. Once again, directly approach them, okay? Directly get in touch with them, ask them that, yes, I saw that you published your paper in this journal. How was your experience? Was it good? Is it reliable? Would you suggest, would you recommend? Okay, so that's another one direct way of confirming, all right? And lastly, and very, very importantly, the fees, okay? So that's the APC, the article processing charge, which all open access journals, predatory or not, yeah, real, whatever, they all publish, they all have an APC, which is the article processing charges, okay? So the publishing fees. But no legitimate or no recognized open access journal will ever ask you for the fees, for the publishing fees or the APCs, before your paper is actually reviewed and accepted for publication. So until and unless you receive the formal letter of acceptance from the journal editor that yes, your paper has been reviewed, we have received your comments, and it has been accepted for publication in this journal, only then you're asked to pay, okay? So if any journal asks you, so you submitted a paper today and tomorrow the journal sends you an email and tells you that, okay, you have to like pay, okay, or like, I don't know, like this many dollars or euros, you should be careful, okay? So I would say that you should rather kind of avoid the journal. Okay, and if you do end up, let me tell you that if you do end up in publishing any of these predatory journals or fake journals, it can be very, very difficult to get those papers retracted. And what happens is that at the end, you wouldn't be able to submit in any journals ever again, because if your paper gets published in any of these fake journals, obviously you won't be able to publish it in any, let's say, good or reliable journal ever again. So that's why you should really be very careful, especially when you're going for an open access journal. Just make sure that you are 100% kind of sure, confirm that this is not a predatory journal or not a fake journal, all right? So if you still need help, okay, finding a journal, okay, so I saw some questions that if any one of you has any question, like, you know, I have written a paper on such and such topic, or I wrote a paper, I have written a paper, I want to write a paper, can you suggest a journal? So of course, I am not the right person to ask. I cannot suggest you a journal because we have almost close to 3,000 journals, all right? I don't even know like 10% of them, or rather 1% of them. So if you need help finding a journal for your work, you can log on to this website. It's a free one, journalsuggester.springer.com. Okay, so you can see that there is, so you have your manuscript. Okay, so you just copy paste the title in the first box and the manuscript text. You see a box below that. So of course, you don't copy the entire, obviously not the entire, your entire manuscript, but just copy the abstract. Okay, copy and paste the abstract here. You hit enter, and this will throw a list of journals. Okay, so use an advanced smart algorithm, journal matching algorithm, and it matches the keywords of in your title and in your abstract, and it will give you a list of journals which you could possibly consider for your paper. All right. So that's I think what's all about. Okay, we also, yeah, I should also mention the transfer desk. Okay, but that comes into play later on if you actually submit your paper to any Springer Nature journal. All right, and if it gets rejected, not because of the scientific quality or the content, but just because it might not be within the scope of that particular journal, we also have something called a transfer desk, which is within Springer Nature. Okay, so your paper gets rejected, but it gets transferred to our transfer desk, and we have experienced submissions editors there. They're called editorial submissions advisors. All right, so they will come back to you and tell you that, okay, sir, you submitted your paper in journal A, but it was rejected owing to this reason. But we have a few suggestions. Okay, so the journal B, C, D could be relevant, or you might consider submitting your paper in journal B, journal C, journal D, where you might have a higher chance of publication. Okay, but then again, it just acts as I would say acts as a recommendation and advisor. It's not binding on you. It's not mandatory that you have to submit in these journals. If you, let's say you wanted to publish in journal A, you did not succeed, you want to withdraw your paper, you're always free to do that, because you're still the owner of your work and owner of your paper. Okay, but the transfer desk option is also very good, but that, as I said, it only comes into play once you have submitted it in a journal, and if your paper has been rejected on grounds of let's say, you know, it didn't fit the scope of the journal. Okay, so that I think will bring us to the last part. I think I'm a little behind time, but I will try to be short and quick here. Okay, so of course, yeah, now that you have the perfect, the manuscript, you're happy with it, and you have picked the right journal, you have chosen the most suitable journal for your work, you have to submit your paper, right? So the first thing that you need to do before you actually think of submitting your paper is you have to write a cover letter, all right? Now, this cover letter is very, very important in that entire submission process. So the cover letter has to be addressed to the journal editor, okay? It's meant for the journal editor, and the journal editor really is the first thing. The cover letter is your first thing that the journal editor actually looks at even before looking at the title or the abstract of your paper, of your actual manuscript, all right? So the cover letter, what is the purpose of a cover letter? The purpose of the cover letter is essentially here to convince the journal editor that your paper is suitable to be published, or at least to be considered for publication in that particular journal, all right? So now it's your, let's say, responsibility to convince, okay, the journal editor that why you think or why you believe that why your paper should be considered for publication in that particular journal. Okay, so now the journal editor's responsibility, as I said, is, okay, to ensure that, the journal grows in reputation. Okay, that's their job, that's their responsibility, that's what they're meant to do. Okay, so now if the journal editor discovers that, of course, your paper is interesting, the results are interesting, and your findings are also, let's say, very relevant, but it's not exactly appealing to the readers of that particular journal, so it wouldn't really interest the audience of that journal, the editor will never send that paper for review. Okay, so it will come back to you from the editor's desk, from the journal editor's desk. So, okay, so here, that's why it's very, very important that before you submit in any journal, okay, any journal, any field, any subject, any topic, any area, open access, non-open access, it's very important that you go through the aims and scope of that particular journal. Okay, so you go to the journal homepage, the web page. Every journal has an aims and scope. You'll find it somewhere at the right-hand side, left-hand corner, somewhere on the page. You read the aims and scope, you understand, fully understand, reread it twice, read it multiple times, so that you know exactly what the journal publishes, exactly what that journal is trying to kind of, capture, what kind of audience the journal is trying to cater to, okay, and what kind of information this journal is trying to disseminate, okay, in terms of the scientific content, all right? So that's the important thing. And why is the cover letter important? Once again, as I said, the editor is the first thing that the journal editor is going to look at. So of course, it also gives the editor a very clear idea about your writing style. Now, if the journal editor is not convinced reading your cover letter, if it's not clearly written and if it's not comprehensible, let's say, the journal editor will never be interested to even take a look at your manuscript, okay? So once again, make sure that you use simple language, okay? So simple, short sentences, try to be clear and to the point. So what kind of information do we want to have in the cover letter? Of course, remember that the journal editors are busy, so don't write pages. So ideally, it should be very short. Try to keep it within a page at max, okay? Always try to start the cover letter by addressing the letter directly to the editor, all right, directly to the editor. So write, dear editor, respected editor. If you know the name of the editor, write dear professor, dear doctor, whatever, okay? If you know the name, if you don't know the name, please write dear editor or respected editor. Never start a cover letter. It's a very bad idea, not advisable to start a cover letter with something like, to whom it may concern, okay? Never do that, okay? It looks very, very unprofessional. All right, so of course, when you start up the cover letter, of course, the first sentence of the letter should always contain the manuscript title, the name of your manuscript, and what kind of an article is it, okay? What is the type? So is it a original research article? Is it a brief communication? Or is it a letter? Is it a review? Is it a comment? Is it an erratum? What is it, okay? So that the editor is very clear about the article type, okay? So then you go about giving a very, very brief background, a short background about the problem. You again concisely, okay, just summarize what's your objective and what was the problem that you wish to address and what is the aims and objective, what is the aim of your, like the goal of your work. And then you talk about, once again, as I said, in terms of when you're writing the conclusion or the abstract, so just summarize the most important findings, okay? Don't go about describing everything that you found, just summarize the most important findings, the key results, and then you go to the conclusion, the later part, the later part of the cover letter, where you actually have to kind of give reason as to why you believe that this particular work will be of sufficient interest to the readership of that journal, okay? And if you know that this is where exactly the aims and scope comes in very handy, if you have read the aims and scope of the journal very well, and if you have understood it, it will really help you to write this particular part where you actually want to give the reason to justify the submission of your manuscript in that particular journal, and you are looking to kind of convince the journal editor that as to why you think this paper, this work would be a good fit for that particular journal. All right. And towards the end of the cover letter, we always look for some additional information. If you wish to include or exclude reviewers, including reviewers, okay, fine. That's fine. You can always suggest names of potential referees, but excluding reviewers, always very important. If you think or believe that, you would like some people to be kind of excluded from the list of referees or reviewers, please mention clearly, separately, that due to reasons of potential conflict or due to reasons of probable conflict, we would prefer the following people, the following individuals or following organizations or labs or groups to be excluded as potential reviewers for this work or for our work. Okay, so this has to be very clearly outlined, because of course, as I said, we do not want we have enough conflict. Okay, so we don't want more conflict. Okay, nobody wants more conflict. I mean, there is enough conflict in the world. So this, if you really outline, if you highlight this thing towards the end of your cover letter to the journal editor, this is always taken into account. Okay, that if there is any potential reason for conflict, whatever reason that might be, you don't really have to clarify that. You just make sure that you clearly identify the names of, be it individuals or organizations, labs, groups, whatever it might be. All right. And lastly, and very importantly, publication ethics. Okay, and here again, I like to ask the question to the audience, of course, that how many of you actually think that ethics is important in publication? Okay, ethics is important in publishing. All right, but yes, of course, I mean, yeah. So I don't know how many of you think, but the answer is, of course, it is very, very important, especially nowadays. Okay, I have seen several questions regarding plagiarism and this kind of stuff. I guess there were several. Sorry. Several people who raised it. So of course, when it comes to publication ethics, I can tell you that, this is something which is very, very important, especially now, especially in modern day publishing. Okay, and this is something which we really lay a lot of emphasis on. All right. So when it comes to talking about ethics or highlighting ethical practices, you really have to keep these key points in mind when you're submitting a paper and when you're writing the cover letter to the editor. Okay, so once again, it's not only about writing it in the cover letter, but you really have to ensure that you practice them. Okay, you have implemented them. Of course, the first thing is that you have to mention that your work is original and it has not been published elsewhere. Second, no multiple submissions. Okay, strictly against publication ethics. Don't do a simultaneous submission, submit it in journal A and journal B, journal C together at the same time. Never do that. It's not a good idea. Remember, you can get blacklisted as authors. Okay, and if you're barred from submitting in a journal, you can be barred from submitting in all the journals belonging to the same publisher. Okay, so never take chances with these things. It can really be, I would say, disastrous for your career. All right. Third point, of course, the authors have to mutually agree on the contents of the paper and on submitting in the journal. Okay, so there should be a statement clarifying that. No conflicts of interest. If any, please clearly outline them. As I said, of course, we always want to avoid any potential conflict of interest, whatever the reasons might be. That's not important. All right. Clearly thank, or let's say acknowledge, if you have any source of funding. Okay, especially if you're publishing open access in open access journals. Okay, and if you have source of funding, if your APCs are being paid from any institutional memberships or institutional partnerships, or if you have any grants, specific grants for that, or even any project funding that you might have. So please clearly label that, identify that we would like to thank, or we would like to acknowledge the following organization, the following grant, or something like that. And lastly, and very importantly, authorship contributions. So this is something which we are of late, I mean, yeah, we've seen a lot of complaints and a lot of issues with authorship. All right. So authorship contributions, what does it mean exactly? So, I mean, the journal editors, they really want to ensure that the authors, all right, the authors listed on a particular paper, they have actually contributed significantly towards the scientific content of the work. So if anyone has not made, anyone you think, you as an author or as a co-author, anyone you think has not made any significant scientific contribution to the work, please ensure that he or she is not on the author list. Okay, so this is something which we always, I mean, especially recently, we found that there are a lot of complaints and a lot of issues coming out of authorship kind of conflicts, all right, disagreements. All right, so here what we mean by authorship contributions, what we mean when we talk about the cover letter is that you should clearly say that, let's say you have 4 authors on the paper, okay, A, B, C, and D. So you should clearly state on the cover letter that what has been the individual contribution of each author. All right. So author A and B maybe perform the experiment together. Author B and C devised the topic. Author A and D wrote the manuscript together. So what has been their specific individual contributions? So this is something which the editors are really looking for. And even some of the journals that I know nowadays, they are making it mandatory to include authorship contributions towards the end of your manuscript. Okay, so towards the end, after the conclusion and just before the references, so that it even become clear to the readers of the work that, okay, what has been the contribution of these people. Okay, so also what we say here is that what should be strictly avoided is no guest authors and no ghost authors. All right, so that's what we say, the message to all new authors, especially, that guest authors, okay, so if anyone has not made any contribution, okay, but he or she, the person is just, you know, might be a very senior, well-respected scientist, and you just put the name of that person because he's a very senior researcher, and you think that it will improve your chances of publication, don't do it. Okay, not advisable. And similarly, no ghost authors. Okay, so if people have made a contribution, they have really significantly contributed towards the scientific, let's say, content, the science involved in the work. So you have to really ensure that no one is left out. Okay, everyone gets his or her due credit. Okay, so that's what it's about, authorship contribution. So these are some of the things. Of course, I mean, yeah, I don't want to really go into a lot of details, but of course, there's a lot of, I mean, when we talk about ethics, it's usually I end up talking about it for half an hour, but yeah, I don't think I have such a lot of time now. So I'll just, yeah, we'll come back to it if you have any specific questions. Okay. And then just let's move on. So of course, once you have been able to convince the editor that your manuscript should be considered, okay, so the next hurdle that you have to cross is a peer review. All right. So I mean, I like this cartoon here, which you see on the left hand side here. Okay, so of course, yeah, so this is supposed to be you and these are supposed to be the reviewers. Okay, but let me tell you, this is just a cartoon. Okay, and this is not the reality. All right, this is not exactly the case, because no one is after your head, or no one is after your life or after your work. Okay, so of course you have to understand that the peer review, the entire peer review process is a very positive process, and it has a lot of advantages. Of course, the first thing is that you have to realize that all these peer reviewers, they give you advice, they look, so no one is, you know, like no one is a professional peer reviewer. Okay, so peer reviewers are basically, they are researchers, they are professors, they are academics, they have their own work, they're teaching, their students, their own research. So they all peer reviewers, even some of you who might have reviewed papers for journals know that you actually do it in your free time. Okay, you have to take time out from your schedule to review a paper, to read and give feedback. Okay, so you as an author, so what is happening is basically some experts are actually giving you advice and giving you free advice. Okay, so I think it's better to use that advice for the improvement of your work rather, okay, so and take it positively rather than criticizing and complaining about it. Okay, so the other advantage is also that the peer review, the process, the entire peer review process, it acts as a filter. All right, so if there was no peer review, anything and everything would get published, like it happens with these predatory journals or fake journals. Okay, but with the peer review process, we really ensure that, you know, we filter the content, filter the scientific, the validity or the quality of the scientific content that is published every day. So what happens as a result, this entire process, this entire peer review process, it only actually helps to grow the field, okay, to advance the field by ensuring that only the relevant, important, and the significant work, significant research is published, and the rest is filtered out. Okay, so of course, this is the typical journey of your manuscript. Okay, I mean, I just want to, I mean, why am I showing you this? Because I just want to tell you, you all know what happens. I mean, yeah, I don't want to go into all the details. But what I want to really highlight on is that in some cases, of course, your manuscript might just come back from the editor's desk. Okay, if the editor feels that it just does not meet, let's say, the requirements of the journal. If your manuscript is rejected by the editor, it doesn't mean, once again, let me tell you, that it is bad, the quality is not good, or your science is not good. It just might as well be that it doesn't fit the scope of the journal, and that's why the editor decided to reject it, send it back to you. But of course, it often happens that, you know, your paper most likely gets reviewed, and the reviewers, they come back with a set of comments or suggestions, okay, to the editor. And if the reviewers tell the editor, the journal editor, that, okay, if these comments or these, you know, like these points, they are addressed, if the author is able to address these points, we would be happy to recommend it for publication. Okay, so now what the editor does is the editor sends these reviewers' comments back to you. Okay, so then the editor asks you to submit a revised manuscript. Okay, so of course, once you have the chance to resubmit a revised manuscript, I mean, anybody would like to do that. I mean, of course, that is preferable because you have a good chance that your paper might be accepted. So when you are submitting a revised manuscript, it's important that you have a response letter. Okay, so right, remember when we submitted the paper for the manuscript for the first time, you had to have a cover letter. Okay, so cover letter addressed to the editor. So when you are resubmitting a revised version of your paper, there has to be a response letter, once again, directly addressed to the editor. Okay, so now the purpose of the, I'll tell you what the purpose of the response letter is, but the common mistake that we most like often find in these response letters and with the revised, with the resubmitted articles, is that the response letter only says that, okay, we have made the revisions or we have done the revisions, without actually stating that what and where are these revisions, okay, where to find them, or what were those revisions, or what were those corrections. Okay, so you have to understand that these journal editors, they're very busy people, all right? So they receive like maybe tens or dozens of paper every day, and some big journals, they receive like maybe hundreds of papers by the day. So of course, the journal editor doesn't really have time to sit down and look at your first version of the manuscript and take your revised version and compare, like word by word or line by line, and see that, okay, let me see where have you made the changes, okay? And you also have to understand and remember that the journal editor is the most important person in this whole submission cycle. Okay, so the journal editor actually holds all the cards. Okay, so it's not good to give a hard time to the journal editor. Okay, so you really don't want to make the journal editor's life complicated or give him or her a hard time. Okay, so what you need to do is basically you need to make it easy for the journal editor to identify where or what those changes were. Okay, so what you need to do is basically what kind of information are the editors looking for here. So of course you have to state whether you agree or disagree with the comments of the reviewers. Of course, if you agree, perfect, all good. If you don't agree, if you want to kind of contest, or if you like, let's say you're not in you do not share the same opinion as the reviewers. So of course, in that case, it's not enough, once again, not enough to say that, okay, we don't agree what the reviewers say, or we don't like, all right? Of course, if you disagree, if you have a different opinion, you have to give a very clear scientific argument, scientific explanation as to why you think that the reviewers are not right, or they might not be right, and what you have exactly tried to show or what you've tried to prove, all right? So of course, that's what we mean, that if you disagree, you have to support it with a strong scientific evidence, all right? So of course, again, the reviewers might have suggested to do like, some new studies, new calculations, or new experiments. So if you have done them, please clearly state in the response letter that you have performed some new studies, new calculations, or new experiments, and these were included. Also, if you have changed the text or revised the figures, included new figures or excluded figures, all these should be clearly outlined here, okay? But once again, remember, try to keep it short, try to keep it within a page, don't write very long letters, it's not useful and doesn't help, all right? And lastly, and it's a very simple thing, okay, so if you have made these changes in the text, please indicate clearly on the response letter where exactly to find those changes. And the best would be, if you could actually highlight those changes on the revised manuscript. Once again, it's very easy to do it with all these, like the PDF editing tools that you have now. So if you really changed the text, incorporated, especially included or incorporated new text, just try to highlight them directly on the manuscript PDF, okay, with a different color or underlining them, and indicate the page and the line numbers on your response letter, so that the journal editor, it's easy for the journal editor to really locate where you have made those changes, okay? So now you might think that why am I actually talking about the response letter so much, or why am I stressing on it, okay? So you might just as well, okay, fine, you have made the revisions, you have done what the referees had suggested, so that's it, you just resubmit it, and yeah, just tell the editor to have a look at it. Okay, so as I said, like the journal editor is the most important person, the key person here in this whole cycle. So if you have a good response letter, okay, a clearly written response letter, so what the journal editor does, of course, the journal editor has a look at your response letter, and then has a look at takes a look at your revised manuscript. Now, if the journal editor is convinced that, all right, you have taken into consideration all the points raised by the referee, you have addressed like properly all the points or all the issues or all the kinds of, doubts or queries that the referees had raised, you have addressed them correctly and satisfactorily, the journal editor actually has the power to accept the paper without sending it for the review to the reviewers, okay? So what you do basically is, if you spend the time, sometime half an hour, 1 hour in writing a good response letter, you actually expedite your publication time. Because if you don't, what happens is the journal editor looks at it and says that, okay, I'm not really sure what are the changes, if you really have made some changes, or is it enough, or is it sufficient? Okay, I don't care. We'll send it back to the reviewers and let them decide. Okay, so basically what happens is you end up losing some time. Okay, so all this is basically writing a good response, idea of writing a good response letter is just to ensure that you can save some time, all right, while trying to publish your work. So I think that with that we will summarize. Of course, we essentially saw that, okay, so what I tried to state right at the start, at the beginning, is that, what we should try to keep in mind is the key message that, of course, we want to do here is we want to increase the chance of your, of course, getting published. But it's not only about getting published, but how do you effectively get published, and how do you create, how do you make an impact of your research? Okay, so because all of it actually, if you can follow these 3 steps, okay, efficiently, so all of it, what it does is it helps you to build your career, to build your reputation, and not only your reputation, also the reputation of the institution or the organization you're working for. All right, so I think that will bring us to the end. And of course, thank you for listening. And yes, if you have any questions, I think we have a bit of time maybe, right?
Thank you, Dr. Chakraborty. That was really a very informative presentation. And I'm sure this session will help us, faculties, as well as researchers present in the webinar to write a better scientific article next time. Now this session is open for discussion. And as you have already addressed most of the questions, we have a few more. Actually, our chat box is flooded with questions from participants,
All right.
which you know, more than
Yeah.
500.
Yeah,
And
sure.
I apologize to them that due to time constraints, we will not be able to address all of them. And
Okay, yeah, sure.
there are some questions which has appeared repeatedly. So let us
Okay.
ask them
Yeah,
first.
sure.
Okay.
Yes.
So provide information on plagiarism detection softwares, preferably which are free.
Right, right. Yes, that's, I saw that question. Okay, I mean, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good
it was in
question,
the
of course.
registration form.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, when I was talking about the publication ethics, and I was talking about the first point, original and unpublished. So usually that's when I ask people that, what do you mean by originality? Okay, what does it mean if you just say that, okay, my work is original? Okay, so when it comes to originality, I mean, originality of the work, it's not only about originality in writing, it's also about the concept, the idea, and the entire scientific work. Okay, so be its conception, be its implementation, and be its writing. And of course, plagiarism is a big issue, especially nowadays, right? So of course, as far as I know, I don't know of any free plagiarism checker, free similarity checker. We use, okay, so at Springer Nature, we use Authenticate. So there are many, I don't know, there are dozens of them available in the market. I mean, you know, Authenticate, there's Turnitin, I don't know, there are several of them. But of course, as far as I know, I'm not aware of any free plagiarism software, okay? So, but yeah, what I can tell you, okay, so like if people are worried about this thing, so I mean, try to, you know, like when you're writing a manuscript, try to keep it original, okay? I understand that sometimes it can be tempting. You read a good piece of like, you know, like research or article or something like that, and you might be very, you know, like you are so deeply motivated and inspired by it that you end up writing something exactly the same. Try avoid doing that, okay? I understand it can be difficult sometimes to you know, like, yeah, frame really draft good manuscripts, but okay, of course it comes with practice. None of us are actually native English speakers, so we all learn English at different stages of our education life. So I understand it can be times difficult, but I think it's advisable at the same time, you know, like you write something and you get it, you know, like kind of corrected by some of your colleagues or friends who you think have a better, let's say, language skills than you. Okay, so that's something I would suggest.
Is Urkund software sufficient for plagiarism check?
These kind of questions, I'm afraid I'm not the right person to ask, okay, because I can tell you that I'm not really an expert on plagiarism tools. I mean, as I said, we use only Authenticate, but I can tell you something. So most of these tools, okay, Urkund, Authenticate, Turnitin, they use the same basic algorithm. All right, so you have to understand that. So the only difference is that, I mean, I don't know much about Urkund because I've never used it. I've only used Authenticate myself. The only difference lies in the fact that how much access, okay, so these softwares, how much access does it have to? So access means like access to existing web content. Okay, so the larger the database of that particular tool, the better the checker. It's obvious because that's the point.
Okay, so there is another question. What are the parameters to identify a good journal?
Okay, yes. Parameters to identify a good journal. Yeah, that's a tricky question. Well, as I said, you know, like, yeah, the idea, the message here, what we always say is that you should not try to focus on the impact factor of the journal, rather try to focus on the impact of your work. That should be your goal. But of course, if you talk about numbers, all right, so there are several. So it's not only the impact factor is, of course, is very well known for, you know, like for determining, let's say, the rank or the reputation or the prestige of a journal. There are several of them nowadays. Okay, there's something called the SJR, the SciMago Journal Rank. There's also the site score. There's also the SNIP, the source normalized impact impact per paper. So you can check all of those. I mean, they're easily available on most journal websites. But I would say there is no hard and fast rule, or there is no one single indicator which tells you that this is a good journal and this is not such a good journal. Okay, because again, impact factors can be misleading. All right, so impact factor of a mathematics journal, let's say a 2 point something impact factor of mathematics journal, is actually extremely good, I would say, compared to, let's say, a life science or a bio journal, because obviously impact factors also varies strongly from field to field, subject to subject, and topic to topic. So that's not really a hard and fast rule. You say that, oh, okay, this journal has an impact factor of 2.1, you know, like, okay, it's not really a good journal. No, I mean, not really. Yeah, so it really depends on the subject area. And that's why we also have source normalized impact per paper. There's an IP score, there's an IP number, which is basically a weighted average. So it takes into account the weighted citations of a particular subject area. So it gives you a better, let's say, you know, like a citation impact or citation idea about the journal. So I wouldn't say that. So to come back to the question, I mean, yeah, I think I saw it there, that how, like, yeah, how do you identify a good journal? So there is no single parameter to identify a good journal.
Okay. So someone asked, my lab has 4-5 years old unpublished data. Can it still be considered for publication?
Yes, of course. If somebody else hasn't published it yet, why don't you go ahead and publish it? I don't know why you're waiting for so long, but yes, of course, you just look in the scientific literature, and if you realize that it has not been published yet, of course, please go ahead. It can be 5 years old, it can be 15 years old, as long as no one has published it, it's still new, so that's fine.
There are multiple questions regarding writing review. May I ask?
Yes, okay, yes, right, yeah, that's, I think I also saw that, yeah, because
in the chat box as well as in the registration
one
form,
of you already mentioned this. Yes, I wanted to touch upon it, I think, during that. So that's why I already mentioned it, you know, right at the start, that it's not about review, so you should not have, so that, you know, readers do not start thinking about it. Yes, review articles, yes, I know it's very tempting, it's very interesting, but my advice is that unless you are a well-established, well-renowned researcher with at least 15-20 years of experience in a particular field, don't write review articles. Okay, very less chances you'll get published. And also in most of our journals, we publish reviews only by invitations. Okay, so journal editors invite authors to write reviews most of the times. Okay, I mean, more than 90% of the times. And we do not really encourage a lot of publishing unsolicited reviews, because the quality is questionable. And if somebody, I think somebody mentioned, I had this question somewhere about pros and cons of writing review articles in high impact factor journals.
Yes.
Somebody
Yeah.
posed that question, I
Yeah.
remember. If you are a young, like first time author or young researcher, young authors, I think it's extremely difficult if you try to publish a review in a high impact journal. I would say, like, to be perfectly honest, I would say that you will never succeed. All right. And somebody mentioned that, yeah, it's more convenient to write reviews. Of course, I know it's convenient to write reviews, but what happens is, I mean, let me tell you, writing a review article is actually much more difficult than writing an original research article. All right. Because when you're writing an original research article, you know exactly what you have done, because you have done all the work. You are supposed to have done all the work. Okay. So you're supposed to know you know about the background, you know what are the details. But when you're writing reviews, what often happens, what we have seen, I can tell you from my experience, is that it's basically patches from different papers. Okay, so different published papers. So that is not what we call a review. Okay, so something 2 paragraphs from here, 2 paragraphs from there, 2 paragraphs from here, and to end it up with a very general conclusion. That is not at all a good review, and that's why we always discourage young researchers, young authors from writing review articles. Okay, so as I said, I mean, at least I know about all the Springer Nature journals, we mostly publish reviews from invited authors, and we do not encourage unsolicited reviews. Okay, so it's very rare that we publish, you know, some random reviews which are submitted to us. So that's, even if there is something else still regarding reviews, you can just ask me.
Somebody asked, what methodology should be adopted for data collection while writing a review article?
I am not sure if I fully understand the question. What methodology should be adopted for data collection? I'm not really sure exactly what kind of what that question implies.
Okay.
If you're talking about some specific study, or if you're talking about a specific field, or there are a lot of different ways to collect data, right? So it really depends on your area of work, your topic. I'm not sure I fully understand what that means.
The next question is it better to write the result and discussion section together rather than write them separately?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I mean, yeah, well, I would say, like, as I said, so it depends again, once again, on the journal. Ideally, generic articles, like, as I said, original research articles, is good to separate them. But once again, let's say you're submitting, you wish to submit in journal A. All right. So it's advisable that you go to journal A, look at a few papers, okay, and try to look at their style. Okay, what do the authors usually do? So do they prefer that the results and discussion are separated, or do they prefer that if it's together? So this again is a little tricky. Okay, it really depends on the kind of journal that you're publishing in. But it might sometimes happen that that you have page limits or word limits. So in that case, you really don't want to like put headings and separate all the sections. So you just want to like make paragraphs, and that's it. So in those kind of cases, if you really do have page limits or word limits, I think maybe you could just actually club the results and discussion together. All right. So it again depends on the choice of your journal,
Okay.
particular journal. Yeah.
Okay. So due to time constraints, we can take one more question.
Okay.
Any
Yes.
advantage for any advantage for multi-institutional involvement regarding acceptance of a paper?
Okay. Once again, I'm not fully sure if I understand it. I mean, well, if you are talking about multi-institutional
Involvement.
involvement. All right.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, my straightforward answer would be no. So if you're talking about multi-institutional involvement, means like collaboration between different institutions or organizations, universities, or even like from institutions or universities from abroad. That is not really a criteria, which is never, yeah. So your affiliations, your collaborations, these things are never really taken into account while deciding the scientific merit or validity or the significance of scientific paper. Okay, so if that is what the question means, yeah. Okay. Is there any quick question?
Actually, we are running short of time. So
yeah, I know. I think I
yeah.
would just like to I would just like to highlight one thing else, because I remember one of these questions that was raised apart from the regular ones. So somebody had asked about subscription to Springer journals and books, ebooks, of course. So if anyone is interested in subscribing to Springer books or ebooks or journals, I mean, you can just send me an email. I mean, yeah, my email was there on the last slide. Okay, so it's akash.chakraborty@springernature.com. So just send me a quick email or ask your librarian or chief of library to send me a quick email that you're interested in taking. I will connect you to the, like my relevant people in my sales colleagues who will help you out. So yeah, that's the point here. So otherwise, I think, yeah, I would like to thank you once again. So,
thank you. Thank you. With this question answer session comes to an end, and thank you so much, Dr. Chakraborty. Now, I would like to request our IQAC coordinator and our DBT-Star College coordinator, Dr. Suchandra Chakraborty, to present the vote of thanks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Deepasree. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
So, a very good afternoon to you all, honorable speaker, valued viewers, DBT-Star family members, worthy faculty, sincere researchers, and interested students who are virtually present here for our first faculty enrichment program under DBT-Star College scheme, tips and tricks for publishing in international scientific journals. Saying thank you is more than good manners. It is actually good spirituality. And I am really privileged to get this opportunity of delivering vote of thanks in these webinars. On behalf of DBT-Star family of Surendranath College, my first and foremost duty is to express my sincerest gratitude to Dr. Akash Chakraborty for gracing this occasion, sparing his most valuable time, and enriching us with his very informative speech. Dr. Chakraborty, your content today would definitely help young researchers and faculty members to learn the tricks behind publishing in a journal. Thank you, sir, for your crisp and compendious speech. My heartfelt gratitude to DBT, Department of Biotechnology, Government of India, for granting us this fund. We are really indebted to them. We are immensely grateful to the college authority, the governing body, for their constant help, motivation, and support to reach our goals. A special mention to our respected principal, Dr. Indranil Kaur, for being the catalyst that stimulated us to do our best and for standing as a pillar of strength. I also extend my sincere thanks to all my colleagues, both teaching and non-teaching, for their cooperation in time of need. Thanks are due to faculty members of all the 4 departments of DBT-Star family for their tireless effort to make these webinars successful. You know, an event like these cannot happen overnight, but requires prior planning and a bird's eye for in details. And we have been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of very proactive and enthusiastic faculty members, the dedicated members of our technical team. I am short of words for their involvement and willingness to take on the completion of tasks beyond their comfort zones, even in this lockdown period. So kudos to all of them. Last but not the least, I thank all our students. Though this webinar was not meant for them, still their enthusiasm means a lot to us. So with this, let me stop here. Again, rendering my heartfelt thanks to all of you present here virtually with a definite hope of breathing deep in a COVID-free world very soon. All be safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you all. Before you leave the meeting room, a quick notice to my dear participants that you need to fill the feedback form of this webinar by 11:30 p.m. today. Only then will you get the certificates. And another thing which we have noticed for the last 4 webinars that we arranged is that few of your email IDs are not correct. So email is bouncing back. So if you have not yet received the certificates, please check your spam folder and also check that whether you have given the correct email ID or not. This was our first webinar, and we plan to arrange a few more under the DBT-Star trending scheme, which we will definitely try to circulate in our YouTube channel and YouTube channel, as well as Facebook and WhatsApp. So coming up next is a webinar to be arranged on 24th, international webinar and panel discussion. You can see on your screen, prevention and control of vector-borne diseases amidst COVID-19. So hope to see you all soon. If you have not yet registered, registration is mandatory but free. So it's going to be an interesting session. So see you all on 24th of this month. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.